Chapter 16, Promises. Bristol tossed and turned all night with nightmares of Madame Weatherbury battling the Snow Queen. She dreamed the fairy was repeatedly knocked to the ground by a ferocious monster in a fur coat and snowflake crown. Madame Weatherbury reached for Bristol and begged for help, but there was nothing Bristol could do because she was frozen inside a large cube of ice. Even as she woke up in a cold sweat, the images in her dream were so lifelike, Bristol was convinced it was actually happening. And for all she knew, it was. Between the nightmares of Madame Weatherbury in peril and the dreams of witch hunters chasing her through the in-between, Bristol was starting to think she'd feel more rested if she just stayed awake. She stepped out of bed and decided to take a walk through the castle to clear her head. As Bristol walked down the third-floor corridor, she could hear a couple of her classmates snoring in their bedrooms. She passed Xanthus's door and remembered his painful confession from Circle of Secrets. Bristol's heart filled with sympathy for the boy. She decided to check on him and quietly pulled open his heavy steel door. When she peeked into his room, Xanthus was sound asleep on his metal bed, wrapped up in his foil sheets. He had set his pewter metal on his iron nightstand, and while Xanthus slept, the flames on his body increased and decreased as he inhaled and exhaled. Bristol felt strange watching him sleep, but it was nice to see Xanthus resting so peacefully. With his secret finally off his chest, she figured he was sleeping better than he had since arriving at the academy. Before leaving, Bristol waved her wand, and a collection of aluminum dolls appeared in the corner of Xanthus's room, so he would have a fun surprise to wake up to in the morning. The castle was dark and quiet as Bristol moved through it, but she found the solitude comforting. She stepped outside and stood on the castle's front steps and was happy to see that the rain had finally stopped. The night sky was starting to lighten as dawn approached, and the griffins were already awake, hunting for breakfast. Watching the majestic creatures flying through the air reminded Bristol of how lucky she was to live in such a wonderful place. She had been at the academy for less than a month, but already Bristol couldn't imagine living anywhere else in the world, and she hoped she'd never have to. As she gazed around the property, admiring all the colorful trees and flowers, Bristol spotted something shiny moving toward her in the distance. Madame Weatherbury's golden carriage had returned to the academy, and Bristol was so thankful to see it she jumped up and down with excitement. Eventually the carriage pulled up to the castle's front steps, and Bristol ran to it to greet her teacher. "Madame Weatherbury," she cried. "I'm so glad you're back. I was worried you—" The carriage door swung open and Bristol stopped in her tracks. She hardly recognized the woman inside. Madame Weatherbury had aged another decade. She wore a thick violet coat that covered her whole body from the neck down, and there was a large black bruise on the left side of her face. She looked at Bristol and the castle in a daze, like she was confused about where she was. Madame Weatherbury tried to climb down from the carriage, but she was so weak she could barely stand, and the fairy collapsed on the ground. "Madame Weatherbury!" Bristol screamed. Madame Weatherbury spent the whole day resting in her office. The only person she allowed inside was Mrs. V, and that was to deliver bandages and rubbing alcohol. Bristol paced outside the doors and waited for the housekeeper to emerge with an update. When Mrs. V finally stepped out, the concern in her eyes told Bristol everything she needed to know. "How is she?" Bristol asked. "Better, but not by much," Mrs. V said. "I cleaned the wound on her face, but it was the only injury she would let me look at. A few of her bones might be broken, but she wouldn't let me get near them." "Can't she heal herself with magic?" Bristol asked. "Usually," Mrs. V said, "unless the injuries were caused by magic." "Did she tell you what happened?" Bristol asked. "She said she slipped and fell while she was visiting her friend," Mrs. V said. "A fall?" Bristol said. "She said a fall caused this?" Mrs. V sighed. "I don't want to start rumors, But if I'm honest with you, I'm starting to get a little suspicious. With all the strange letters, the unexpected trips, the witches, and now this, I think something is going on that Madame Weatherbury isn't telling us. Clearly, the housekeeper thought her suspicion was a brand new discovery. I'm glad you found me this morning, Mrs. V said. Lord knows Madame Weatherbury would rather have crawled into the castle than call for help. She wants to save the world, but heaven forbid if someone cares for her. What did you tell your classmates? I just told them Madame Weatherbury returned early this morning and wasn't feeling well, Bristol said. I tried to be as vague as possible so they wouldn't worry. Well, I hope it works, Mrs. V said. Madame Weatherbury said she would like to speak to you now. Maybe you'll have better luck finding out the truth than I did. But I have to warn you, she's not in her normal spirits. The housekeeper headed down the floating staircase to put the unused bandages away. Bristol knocked on Madame Weatherbury's door and peered inside the office. Madame Weatherbury? Bristol asked. Mrs. V said you wanted to see me? The fairy was seated behind her glass desk and looked so exhausted Bristol thought she might fall asleep at any moment. She had popped the collar of her violet coat to conceal the bruise on her face. The veil on her fascinator was lowered to cover her weary, bloodshot eyes. Besides being tired and injured, Madame Weatherbury was completely drained of her cheerful disposition, and she stared at the floor with a melancholy longing. Close the door behind you, she said softly. Bristol followed her instructions and then sat at Madame Weatherbury's desk. How are you feeling? Bristol asked. I heard you had a bad fall while you were visiting your... You can stop pretending, Bristol, Madame Weatherbury said sharply. I know you're aware of much more than you're letting on. Bristol's initial instinct was to act like she didn't know what the fairy was talking about, but as Madame Weatherbury looked deeply into her eyes, Bristol realized her performance was useless. How did you know? She asked. Sometimes magic has a mind of its own, Madame Weatherbury said. On your first day at the academy, I suspected the castle put you in a bedroom directly above my office for a reason. It wasn't until I was leaving with the witches and you hugged me goodbye that I realized why. The castle put you in that room because it wanted you to spy on me. It knew we would be having this conversation long before I did. Madame Weatherbury, I don't understand, Bristol said. What conversation are we having? Before we get into that, I want to make sure we're on the same page, the fairy said. I'm sure you've developed a few theories to explain my questionable behavior, so tell me what you think is going on, and I'll fill in the blanks. Bristol was thrilled for an opportunity to finally learn the truth, but she worried that Madame Weatherbury wasn't in the right state of mind to be handing out information. Are you sure you want to do this now? She asked. I don't want you to regret it later. I insist, Madame Weatherbury said. All right then, Bristol said. From the information I've gathered so far, I know you haven't been leaving the academy to visit a sick friend. You've been traveling to the Northern Kingdom to help solve something called the Northern Conflict. And what do you suspect the Northern Conflict is? Madame Weatherbury asked. Bristol hesitated to respond. As ridiculous as it sounds, I believe the Northern Conflict is just a code name for a woman known as the Snow Queen. Go on, the fairy said. Well, the Snow Queen is a very powerful witch who's been attacking the Northern Kingdom, Bristol continued. She's covered the kingdom in icy blizzards and caused massive amounts of destruction. No matter what the Northern Kingdom's army does, they haven't been able to defeat her yet. Before you had the idea to start our academy, you saw defeating the Snow Queen as an opportunity to gain worldwide acceptance for the magical community. You thought if someone like you saved the world, then the world would finally have a reason to respect people like us. So you teamed up with the witches and created a plan to stop her. But it's been more difficult than you predicted. Bristol felt silly after hearing herself say it all out loud. She half expected Madame Weatherbury to laugh at the outlandish theory, but the fairy never flinched. You're only wrong about one thing, Madam Weatherbury said. Which part? Bristol asked. The Snow Queen is the sick friend that I've been visiting, she said. I haven't been lying about that. After a very tragic loss, my dear friend Queenie became infected with hate, and hate is the most powerful disease on the planet. For years, I watched the illness consume her and change her into a monster, and regrettably, I did nothing to help her. By the time she was wreaking havoc on the Northern Kingdom, it was too late to reason with her. Queenie has been blinded by vengeance. Now violence is the only language she speaks. But how could you be friends with a witch in the first place? Bristol asked. Wasn't she full of evil and darkness to begin with? It's possible to love a person beyond their demons, Bristol, Madam Weatherbury said. After all, there was a chance that Lucy was a witch, but it didn't stop you from following her into the in-between. You chose to love Lucy for who she was instead of what she was, and I made the same choice with Queenie. But unlike you, I failed Queenie as a friend. The angrier and more hateful she became, the more distance I put between us. I abandoned her when she needed me most, and now I'm partially to blame for what she's become. Then she's still alive, isn't she? Bristol asked. If you had already defeated her, you wouldn't be referring to her in present tense. My friend has been dead for years, she said, but unfortunately the Snow Queen is still very much alive and stronger than ever. Bristol glanced up at the enlarged map of magic above the fireplace. If she's so strong, why doesn't she appear on the map? She asked. I'm afraid you won't find the Snow Queen on any map of magic, Madam Weatherbury said. She's made herself untraceable so she can attack without warning. I've managed to stop her destruction from spreading beyond the Northern Kingdom, but each encounter is more taxing than the last. You aren't going to face her again, are you? Bristol asked. Madam Weatherbury closed her eyes and nodded in despair. I'm afraid I have no choice, she said. No one else can face the Snow Queen. Right now, I'm the only thing standing in the way of her attempts at global obliteration. But Madam Weatherbury, you can't, Bristol objected. Fighting her in your condition would be suicide. Madam Weatherbury raised a hand to silence Bristol, and her eyes beamed with a grave urgency. Now we must have the conversation I was referring to earlier, Madam Weatherbury said. Please don't share this with the others, but there is a very strong possibility I won't survive defeating the Snow Queen. I remain optimistic, but one must never let positivity outweigh practicality. It's only a matter of time before I'm called back to the Northern Kingdom, and if I should perish, I want you to take over the Academy. Me? Bristol asked in shock. But what about Mrs. V? Or Tangerina? Or Skylene? Mrs. V and the girls aren't as strong as you are, Bristol, the fairy said. From the moment I placed the magic wand in your hand and watched your star on the map of magic grow, I knew you were the only person who could replace me. So please, if I don't live to see another year, promise me you'll continue my work. Promise me you'll help your classmates reach their full potential. And promise me you'll use your magic to help and heal people and change the world's perspective of the magical community. Tears ran down Bristol's face as she imagined a world without Madam Weatherbury. She couldn't believe the responsibility her teacher was asking her to accept, but Bristol knew in her heart there was nothing she wouldn't do for the fairy. No one could ever replace you, Madam Weatherbury, she said. I could never repay you for the life you've given me, but I promise to continue your legacy in your absence, whether that day comes soon or decades from now. A faint grin grew on the fairy's face, but it quickly faded. Bristol could tell there was something else that Madam Weatherbury needed to discuss with her, and it was a topic the fairy dreaded with all of her might. And now I'm afraid I have an even greater request to ask of you, Madam Weatherbury said. It brings me great pain to place such a heavy burden on your shoulders, but there is no way around it. Bristol was confused. She couldn't imagine a bigger task than the one she had already accepted. What is it? She asked. Madam Weatherbury took a deep breath before making the difficult request. In the event that I perish without defeating the Snow Queen, she said with difficulty, then you must kill her, Bristol. Bristol felt like she had been kicked in the stomach. Her heart began racing, her palms became sweaty, and the office started spinning around her. Madam Weatherbury, I can't kill the Snow Queen, she exclaimed. I've never hurt anyone before. I couldn't even defend myself against the witch hunters. I panicked under pressure. That wasn't your fault. It was mine, Madam Weatherbury said. I've made a grave mistake as your teacher. My lessons have been preparing you and your classmates for the world I wanted you to live in, but I have not prepared you for the world that actually exists. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to begin instructing you and the others in how to use magic to defend yourselves. You may not be ready to face the Snow Queen today, but one day you will be. But Madam Weatherbury, I'm only 14 years old, Bristol reminded her. I'm just a child. You can't ask me to do this. Bristol, you may be young, but you've never had the luxury of being a child, Madam Weatherbury said. You've been a fighter since the day you were born. You looked beyond the limits the world placed upon you and strove for a better life, and now you must look beyond the limits you're placing upon yourself and strive for a better world. If neither of us can successfully defeat the Snow Queen, then everything, the world, the academy, and life as we know it, will be destroyed. Madam Weatherbury was putting Bristol in an impossible position. She had never killed anything before, but now she was being asked to kill the most powerful witch in the world. Bristol wanted to refuse her request with every fiber of her being, but Madam Weatherbury gazed at her with such desperation in her eyes, Bristol didn't have the heart to disappoint the fairy. She looked to the floor and reluctantly nodded in agreement. Okay, Bristol said. I hope and pray it never comes to that, but if you can't kill the Snow Queen, I will. After Bristol made her second promise, Madam Weatherbury closed her eyes, leaned back in her chair, and sighed with relief. Thank you, Bristol, the fairy said. You have no idea how comforting it is to hear you say that. Now, if you'll please excuse me, I should rest. We'll both need all our strength for the days ahead. The next morning, Madam Weatherbury met her students and apprentices on the castle's front lawn to begin their first lesson in magical self-defense. The fairy hadn't joined them for breakfast, and when she finally appeared, the children were shocked to see their teacher in such a fragile state. Besides her bruised face, Madam Weatherbury walked with a glass cane and needed Mrs. V's assistance to climb down the castle's front steps. She was completely drained of her usual charm and energy and had to conduct a lesson while sitting on a glass stool. Please forgive my delicate appearance, Madam Weatherbury told her concerned pupils. I'm recovering from a nasty fall I had while visiting my friend. Did you fall off a cliff? Lucy asked. It looks worse than it feels, Madam Weatherbury said, and swiftly changed the subject. Now for today's lesson, we'll be using our magic for a purpose we haven't explored yet. It doesn't matter how much joy and comfort we spread, because of the challenging times we live in, it's very likely we'll cross paths with people and creatures who wish to harm us. And when the situation is justified, we can use our magic to protect ourselves and others from danger. Your assignment this morning is to use your magic to defend yourself from the forces trying to hurt you. Xanthus, we'll start with you. Xanthus gulped nervously. And what kind of forces will I be defending myself from? He asked. Instead of responding, Madam Weatherberry tapped her cane on the ground 6 times, and 6 scarecrows appeared in the nearby field. The fairy tapped her cane again, and the first scarecrow came to life and detached itself from its wooden post. As soon as its feet touched the ground, the scarecrow charged toward Xanthus with arms flailing in all directions. The boy screamed, and the scarecrow chased him in circles around the property. "I'm not ready for this," Xanthus yelled. "I think someone else should go first." These situations can be alarming, but it's important to remain calm and keep a clear head, Madam Weatherberry said. Take a deep breath and imagine the quickest way to disarm your attacker. Despite the fairy's recommendations, Xanthus couldn't summon tranquility to save his life. The scarecrow eventually caught up to the boy and wrestled him to the ground. His classmates desperately wanted to help him, but Madam Weatherberry wouldn't let them intervene. Xanthus removed his muter metal, and thanks to his anxiety, his body was instantly engulfed in flames. The scarecrow was burned to a crisp and crumbled into a pile of ashes. Xanthus's classmates cheered for him, and the boy stayed on the ground until he caught his breath. "Well done, Xanthus," Madam Weatherberry said. "Tangerina, you're up next." For the rest of the morning, Madam Weatherberry's students took turns magically defending themselves from the enchanted scarecrows. Tangerina splashed her scarecrow's feet with honey, and it became stuck to the ground. Emeralda trapped her scarecrow inside an emerald cage before it even climbed down from its wooden post. Skylene pointed her finger at the scarecrow, and a powerful geyser erupted from her fingertip and ripped it to shreds. Bristol waved her wand, and a flock of white doves raised her scarecrow into the air and dropped it into the sparkling ocean behind the castle. Lucy clapped her hands, and her scarecrow was crushed by a massive piano that fell from the sky. "Finally, something I'm good at," Lucy said. Madam Weatherberry's self-defense lesson was by far the most enjoyable lesson the students and apprentices had participated in. They laughed and applauded one another as they defeated the scarecrows one by one. Bristol was envious of the fun her classmates were having with the assignment. Unbeknownst to the others, Madam Weatherberry's lesson was designed specifically for her, and the exercises were preparing Bristol for a potential confrontation with the Snow Queen. It was hard for her to enjoy herself when the fate of the world depended on how well she perfected her skills. "Terrific work, everyone," Madam Weatherberry said, and clapped with the little energy she could muster. "You've done a wonderful job defending yourself from one attacker, but let's see how you manage when you're outnumbered by the—" "Madam Weatherberry!" Skylene suddenly shouted. "The witches are back!" Everyone jerked in the direction Skylene pointed to, and sure enough, they saw 4 cloaked figures standing at the edge of the property. Just as on their previous visit, the witches instantly made the children uneasy, but no one was more fearful than Bristol. She knew there was only one reason why the witches had traveled to the academy. As soon as their presence was known, Crowbeth, Nutalia, Felina, and Squidell crept toward the fairy and her students. Madam Weatherberry was already so fatigued it was hard to gauge her reaction to the unexpected guests. The fairy slowly got to her feet and stared at the approaching witches with a stoic gaze. Before they exchanged a single word in front of the children, Madam Weatherberry headed for the castle, and the witches followed her. "I suppose this means the rest of our lesson is postponed?" Bristol told the others. "I think I'll take a quick nap before lunch." Bristol hurried into the castle and ran up the floating staircase to her bedroom. By the time she looked through the hole in her bookshelf and peered into Madam Weatherberry's office, her teacher was already seated behind her glass desk. The witches hovered over the fairy like looming predators. Madam Weatherberry rested her head on her hand and didn't even look up at her visitors. "Well, get on with it," the fairy said in a faint voice. "What news have you brought this time?" "King Nobleton is dead," Crowbeth screeched. Madam Weatherberry sat straight up in her chair. "What?" she gasped. "He didn't evacuate Tinsel Heights before she attacked?" No, Squidell grumbled. General White warned him she was approaching and told him to leave the capital, but the king was stubborn and ignored his advice. He and the royal family were in the middle of dinner at the palace when she struck. No one survived. That foolish, foolish man, Madame Weatherbury said, and angrily shook her head. I always knew his pride would be the death of him. Only one city remains in the northern kingdom, Felina growled. The entire population has fled to Appleton Village, and it's only a few miles away from Tinsel Heights. General White is days away from surrendering, and when he does, the kingdom will face extinction. What about the other sovereigns? Madame Weatherbury asked. Why haven't King Champion or Queen Industria or King Warworth sent reinforcements? Don't they realize their kingdoms are in just as much danger as the North? The sovereigns are in denial, Crowbeth screeched. Nobleton assured them he had the situation under control, so that is what the monarchs choose to believe. General White has sent word of Nobleton's death, but they've still denied his request for help. The sovereigns believe the conflict can be contained by closing the borders, Felina growled. They've shut down the protected paths, and now the northern refugees are trapped. The truth is, Champion, Industria, and Warworth will not recognize the threat until the destruction crosses into their kingdoms. Those selfish idiots, Madame Weatherbury yelled, and hit her desk with a clenched fist. I met with the monarchs and warned them of the danger. All of this could have been avoided if they had granted General White's first request for help. Madame Weatherbury closed her weary eyes and massaged her graying temples while she contemplated what to do next. I thought I would have more time to rest, she said weakly. I wanted to be stronger before I faced her again. I didn't think it would be so soon. Celeste, we must strike, Natalia hissed. This could be our last chance to secure the respect we deserve. To Bristol's surprise, Madame Weatherbury looked toward the ceiling at the exact spot where she was watching from. She knew the next thing out of Madame Weatherbury's mouth was meant for her ears. You're wrong, Natalia, the fairy said. If we don't succeed, someone else will secure acceptance for our community in the future, and I have absolute confidence in them. The message was so intimate and direct, Bristol had to remind herself she wasn't actually in the room with Madame Weatherbury. The witches weren't sure who the fairy was talking to and looked around the office in confusion. Madame Weatherbury stood with difficulty and collected her suitcase. If it must be done, it must be done, she told the witches. We can leave as soon as I say goodbye to my students. Madame Weatherbury hobbled out of her office and the witches followed. Bristol couldn't believe the fairy's courage. She could barely stand, and yet she was willing to stand up to the Snow Queen in spite of her failing condition. Bristol's stomach was in knots as she worried about losing her teacher and fulfilling the promises she had made her. By the time she and the others regrouped, everyone was standing outside the castle, and Madame Weatherbury had already broken the news of her departure. You're leaving again? Tangerina said. Already? Unfortunately so, Madame Weatherbury said. My friend has become very ill and doesn't have much time left. I need to say goodbye while I still have the chance. When will you be back? Skylene asked. I don't know, Madame Weatherbury said. I may be gone for a long time, so I want you to continue your training while I'm away. Bristol will be in charge until I return, so please listen to her and show her the respect you'd normally give me. Madame Weatherbury became teary-eyed as she said farewell. I'm going to miss you all very, very much, the fairy said. Being your teacher has been the greatest privilege of my life, and watching you all blossom into fairies has been my greatest joy. Be good to one another, children. They were puzzled by their teacher's touching remarks. Madame Weatherbury hugged each of her students, her apprentices, and Mrs. V goodbye. When it was Bristol's turn, Bristol pulled her teacher into a tight embrace so she could whisper into Madame Weatherbury's ear without the others hearing it. "Please don't go," Bristol whispered. "We aren't ready to lose you." "I wish I could stay," Madame Weatherbury whispered back. "But the universe has other plans for me." "Then take me with you," Bristol pleaded. "Let's face the Snow Queen together. You don't have to do this on your own." "The others need you more than I do," the fairy said. "Take care of them, Bristol, and please remember what you promised me." Madame Weatherbury tossed her brooch on the ground, and the golden carriage grew to its full size. 4 unicorns emerged from a nearby field, and the carriage's reins magically fastened around them. The witches helped Madame Weatherbury into the carriage and took their seats beside her. As they traveled through the property, Madame Weatherbury looked out the window at the grounds, the castle, and the students of her beloved academy. And with one final bittersweet smile, the fairy said 1,000 goodbyes. "That was odd," Esmeralda said. "She's coming back, right?" Mrs. V and the children turned to Bristol for an answer. Even after Madame Weatherbury's carriage disappeared into the hedge barrier, Bristol continued staring into the distance so the others didn't detect the dishonesty in her eyes. "Of course she's coming back," Bristol said. "Madame Weatherbury would never abandon us. Never." 2 whole weeks passed without any word whatsoever from Madame Weatherbury. Bristol didn't think it was humanly possible to worry more than she already has, but her concerns multiplied the longer she waited. She practically lived on the castle's front steps while the fairy was gone, and she spent the majority of each day eyeing the edge of the property, hoping her teacher's golden carriage would reappear in the distance. Every few hours, Bristol snuck into Madame Weatherbury's office to check the fairy's whereabouts on the map of magic. Thankfully, her teacher and the witch's stars were still shining in the Northern Kingdom, so Bristol knew Madame Weatherbury was alive. By the end of Madame Weatherbury's second week away from the academy, Bristol was so distraught she couldn't hide her anguish anymore. She kept to herself and avoided her classmates whenever possible. She barely spoke, but when she did, it was only to bark out orders or make passive-aggressive comments while she supervised the self-defense lessons. The students became so good at the exercises they could each battle a dozen scarecrows on their own, but Bristol still forced them to practice harder and longer each day. "Tangerina, that honey needs to be deeper. Xanthus, those flames need to be higher. Skyline, that water won't be enough to stop a man in armor. Esmeralda, that cage needs to be stronger. And Lucy, self-defense is about more than just dropping heavy instruments on your enemies. Think of something else. Everyone, do it again." Her classmates were getting tired of Bristol's attitude, but no one was more irritated than Lucy. Bristol's constant commanding and criticizing flustered Lucy to no end, and she eventually lost her patience. "That's it," Lucy shouted. "We're not practicing anymore." Before Bristol could enchant a new batch of scarecrows for the lesson, Lucy snatched Bristol's wand out of her hand and held it above her head. "Lucy, give me back my wand," Bristol ordered. "No," Lucy said. "I'm sick of you squawking at us." "Stop being so immature," Bristol said. "Madame Weatherbury told you to respect me." "I'll respect you when the real you shows up," Lucy said. "What's gotten into you, Bristol? You've been acting mean and moody ever since Madame Weatherbury left. I know something is wrong. I'm not giving back your wand until you tell us what's going on." "Nothing is going on," Bristol lied. "Madame Weatherbury left me in charge. I'm trying to train you." "And what are you training us for?" Lucy asked. "You've been drilling us like we're going to war." "Well, maybe we are," Bristol yelled. As soon as the words escaped her mouth, Bristol knew there was no going back. Her outburst proved Lucy's suspicions correct, and the rest of her classmates became just as concerned. Bristol desperately wanted to explain herself, but Madame Weatherbury had specifically asked her not to share the truth with her classmates. Bristol didn't know what to do and was suddenly overwhelmed. She sat on the castle's front steps and tears spilled down her face. "Bristol, what's the matter?" Esmeralda asked. "Why are you crying?" "I wish I could tell you," Bristol said. "Of course you can tell us," Tangerina said. "We might be able to help you," Skyline said. "No, it's between me and Madam Weatherbury," Bristol said. "I don't want you to worry about it." "It's a little too late for that," Lucy said. "Come on. Whatever is troubling you can't be as bad as you think it is. I mean, it's not like it's the end of the world." Lucy's comment only made Bristol cry even harder. Xanthus sat on the steps beside her and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Please tell us what's wrong," he said sweetly. "Secrets are like parasites, remember?" Her friend's curiosity made the situation even more suffocating, and Bristol buckled under the pressure. She knew admitting the truth wouldn't solve anything, but if it released just an ounce of the agony inside of her, it would be worth breaking her teacher's trust. "Madam Weatherbury hasn't been leaving the academy to visit a sick friend. At least not in the way you think," she said. "She's been traveling to the Northern Kingdom to fight the Snow Queen." "What?" Lucy blurted. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth," Bristol said. "How do you know this?" Esmeralda asked. "Madam Weatherbury told me herself," Bristol said. "That's the northern conflict that she's been discussing with the sovereigns and the witches in secret. The Snow Queen has become so powerful, Madam Weatherbury is the only person who can stop her. So far, she's prevented the Snow Queen's destruction from spreading beyond the Northern Kingdom, but each encounter leaves Madam Weatherbury weaker than before. I begged her to let me go with her, but she was adamant about going alone." "Are you saying Madam Weatherbury is in danger?" Tangerina asked. "As much danger as someone can be in," Bristol said. "Madam Weatherbury said she's optimistic, but she's already made plans in case she doesn't survive. If she perishes while defeating the Snow Queen, Madam Weatherbury wants me to take over the academy, and if she perishes before defeating the Snow Queen, she says I'm the one who has to kill her." At first it was difficult for her classmates to believe everything Bristol said, but the more they thought about it, the more it explained Madam Weatherbury's mysterious behavior. Bristol didn't blame her friends for being skeptical. She had known the truth for weeks, and it was still hard for her to believe it. "Well, the chicken thickens," Lucy said, and placed her hand on her hips. "Bristol, why didn't you tell us sooner?" Skyline asked. Bristol sighed. "Madam Weatherbury didn't want you to know," she said. "That's why I've been acting like such a lunatic. It's been torture keeping all of this to myself. I'm not ready to lose Madam Weatherbury, and I'm certainly not ready to kill the Snow Queen. I've never felt so helpless in my entire life. And now I've only made it worse by burdening you guys with my problems." "Your problems?" Esmeralda said. "Bristol, I appreciate your loyalty, but you're crazy if you think these are only your problems. If Madam Weatherbury is in danger, then it concerns all of us. You shouldn't have to go through all this by yourself." "Esmeralda's right," Lucy said, "and I don't care what she asked of you. If Madam Weatherbury doesn't survive, we would never let you face the Snow Queen on your own." "Yeah," Xanthus said. "We made a pact to help and protect each other. You'll always have us as backup." Bristol was touched by her friend's support. Their willingness to help her lifted some of the weight Madam Weatherbury had placed on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. "I just wish there was something I could do besides wait. I've been hoping and praying Madam Weatherbury defeats the Snow Queen and lives to tell the tale. But that doesn't..." Suddenly, Bristol went quiet when she was distracted by something strange in the distance. The academy grounds were cloaked in a dark shadow that gradually consumed the entire property. The students and apprentices looked up and saw that the darkness was being caused by a thick layer of gray clouds that had rolled in from the north and covered the sun. Bristol figured it was just another rainstorm until she noticed something white and fluffy descending from the sky. She reached out her hand and watched in amazement as a single snowflake landed in her palm. "Is that snow?" Skylene asked. "It can't be," Tangerina said. "It's never snowed here before." "It's not even cold out," Emeralda said. A quiet hush fell over the classmates and they exchanged fearful expressions. The students and apprentices knew they were all thinking the same exact thing. There was only one explanation. "It's the Snow Queen," Lucy declared. "Her powers must be growing if her storms are reaching us." "And Madam Weatherberry must be in trouble," Xanthus exclaimed. The others began to panic, but as Bristol watched the snowflake melt in her hand, she had a significant change of heart. She wasn't going to waste any more time living in fear. She wasn't going to spend another ounce of energy worrying. She was done with waiting and hoping for Madam Weatherberry's safe return. And after weeks feeling helpless, Bristol knew exactly what she needed to do. "I don't know about you guys, but I refuse to sit back and let a frosty old witch take Madam Weatherberry away from us," she said. "What should we do?" Xanthus asked. Bristol turned to her classmates and beamed with determination. "Everyone, get your coats," she said. "We're going to save her."